Thanks, everyone. This is my first time in Prague, so it's been really lovely, and I'm delighted to be able to see a lot of you here. I have a question for all of you, why you're here at all. Have any of you either considered writing a book before? Can I get a show of hands? Okay, we've got a couple. What about any other big project that you wanted to do as part of your work? You can, take that broadly. Some kind of big project that you've wanted to do for a while. Yeah? For the people who are interested in writing a book, have you started that process? Have you started writing or looking into how to do it? Okay, I've got some casual nods. Alright, so the point of this presentation is to show you, a bit of a behind-the-scenes look into what it was like writing a book. And the idea isn't necessarily that you should then go and write a book for some publisher, although if you want to, the idea is that you should be able to have a bit of an understanding of how to do that. But really for any kind of bigger project that you want to do, where you might need to get help from some other kind of, organising body, the process would be largely similar. So the idea is that, you can leave here this afternoon having a better idea of how to go about that. So the process itself was probably, both shorter and longer than I anticipated. If any of you have done big writing projects before, like PhDs or other longer blogs, I guess, I think when I timed out how long I expected it might take to write, 70,000 words, I kind of just took my, the period of time it would take me to write 1,000 words and then extrapolated that out, which was ridiculous because it didn't account for all of the editing time and rewrites and changes in messaging, and then things get updated over time and in AI really quickly. So the writing time was really truncated. The production time was a lot longer than I expected. And I'll go into sort of why that is and how you might be able to learn a bit about why that's the case as well. So I asked you this question because a lot of the time when I mention, writing a book with no Starch press, the most common response I get is, oh, I've always wanted to write a book, but I just haven't known how to do it. And the thing with no Starch press is that it's really accessible. Anyone can go and submit a pitch through their website, and there's quite a lot of clear information about exactly how to do that and what you should expect. But for other kinds of, for other publishers, it's not so clear-cut. So I'll go into that too. But a lot of the time when I'm speaking to friends or colleagues about this, the biggest problem I find is that they're not sure if anyone would want to read that book. And I think if you want to write it, for some reason, maybe there's a gap that you've perceived, or you wish that someone would cover something in more detail, then probably someone would want to read that book. So I hope that's encouraging for any of you who might be considering that, and that's a blocker. So a bit about me, to paint a picture of how it'll happen. So I've been working at the intersection of data science and cybersecurity for about 10 years, but I started in data science. So I didn't necessarily come from a cybersecurity background. I was working building machine learning models, initially in Australia's Department of Defence. And so back in 2017, we were building chatbots for the Navy and Air Force. I don't know if they really needed those chatbots. I think they just wanted to spend money on AI. But it was really interesting work to be involved in. And it ended up giving me a much better sense for the sort of national security community and that intersection with both AI and security. I then worked at a startup in the United States for a little while, but then COVID happened, and so I went back home to Australia. And not to make it sound like a plan B or anything, but the only place hiring was the Australian Signals Directorate, which is our equivalent of GCHQ in the UK or the NSA in the USA. I don't know the regional equivalents, I'm sorry. But it was a really interesting environment to be in because over the time that I was there, I saw a number of different teams, and that's how I got to use my data science skills in cybersecurity settings. And I started doing a PhD in this field called adversarial machine learning. which is all about hacking or disrupting machine learning models at a more statistical level. It wasn't really about looking at, AI systems. It was more about how we could manipulate machine learning models. And so by the end of my time at ASD, I was the acting technical director of the AI Hub. And the AI Hub basically had the remit of advising Australia's intelligence and national security communities on AI adoption and strategy, and especially safety and security. And I saw that security was taken really seriously. But it was challenging because, outside of that job, I was doing my PhD in this field that was seen as very academic and, not real world applicable in any way. Certainly back in 2020. And so I left my job and I started a company thinking, well, everyone needs to know about AI security. And that's a really terrible environment to start a company with. If there's no market demand for a product, what on earth did I think I was going to be selling? So I basically spent a couple of years telling people that they should care about AI security. And I did things that at the time felt like I was going back to being 20 years old. I had a YouTube channel and I started doing social media, and it was really fun, really funny. But the whole thing felt very hacky. I really didn't feel like, someone who'd been in the job that I had. I definitely wasn't taken seriously when I was doing it. But then, a bit over a year ago, suddenly agentic AI became really important, and then everyone suddenly knew about AI security. And for the first time, instead of begging people for work, I had so much inbound interest that it was really difficult to scale really quickly. But it's been great because now lots of different kinds of organizations want to know about AI security. And last year, my company developed the first AI security framework in the Australian government outside of national security. So it felt like a really nice sort of going back to where it began. The reason I highlight that journey is because I had always seen this problem of this lack of awareness in specifically how I defined AI security. So when we're at conferences like this, a lot of the time people talk about AI security as using AI for cybersecurity. So whether that's offensive or defensive, and being able to do things like either use LLMs to write malware or classify malware or detect it, or do anything else related to security. And that's a very valid use case. I look at it from the other perspective, actually. So I mentioned that I came from data science and machine learning. I define AI security as securing AI systems themselves. But I will cover that in more detail when I get to those slides. So the book process itself began in 2024. So this is sort of towards the end of that, 2 years where I was talking about, where I was wandering around and telling people about AI security, and no one seemed to take me seriously. Then a few things happened around that time, which were quite important and spoke to more the landscape I was in. So to explain that, I'll go back to the beginning. So I hope people get the Hillary Duff reference, maybe not all of you. But I mentioned before that there's key distinction between AI for security and AI security, security of AI systems, really defines what I saw as a gap in the field. And there's this other very big gap when it comes to what exactly is going wrong with artificial intelligence systems. And a way that I like to think of it is in terms of the direction of harm. So most of the time, if I look at different news websites or AI incident repositories, of which there are now half a dozen, possibly more, there are thousands and thousands of AI-specific incidents that are being logged. And these are a few examples of them. These are the kinds of incidents where they're being used to, AI is being used to create deepfakes. It's used for misinformation, disinformation, fraud, scams. Essentially, AI is doing something bad. But there isn't so much attention on when someone, a human or an AI attacker, is doing something bad to AI. And so that was the field that I was looking at. So when I talk about AI safety versus AI security, the definitions aren't meant to be it's either one or the other. But in terms of the direction of threat, it's this orthogonal paradigm where it's really clearly distinguished between whether it's an AI safety threat, so the AI is doing something bad, or it's AI, security of AI, where it's someone trying to hack or disrupt the AI system in some way. And then, of course, AI security as, AI for cybersecurity also gets muddied with a way that I see a lot of AI safety researchers talk about AI security, which is usually traditional cybersecurity controls for AI frontier labs. And so because I sit at this intersection of artificial intelligence and security, most of the people I work with in AI, more like safety researchers, they're more looking at how to make sure that as AI systems become very, very capable, they don't become so capable that they become like deceptive or they over-optimize on proxies that, the human designers didn't intend. And they tend to focus more on the frontier AI capabilities by labs like, OpenAI and Anthropic. And so for them, AI security is actually just basic cybersecurity hygiene on those kinds of labs to make sure that, other nations don't get access to them. So there's all this very muddy water when it comes to what AI security actually is. But what I really cared about was understanding whether AI systems themselves could be attacked, and not just the AI system, which, is really important to have traditional cybersecurity measures, but whether there was anything fundamentally different about machine learning models that meant that they could be attacked differently. So that was the nature of the research that I was doing, and doing in preparation for the book as well. Has anyone heard of adversarial machine learning before? A couple of kind of indication nods. Okay, so basically adversarial machine learning is this field that rose to prominence in 2013 because of this original research paper that showed an example a bit like this, but it didn't use the Terminator as the reference. But basically the idea was that you could take any clean image, so just a normal image, and then you have some sort of target machine learning model that you're trying to disrupt or compromise or deceive in some way. And so based on that target model, you craft these very special adversarial perturbations, basically just like noise, but it's not random noise. It's specially crafted based on the statistical knowledge of that model. And then you superimpose that on top of the original image. You give it to that model and it's not able to work. It misclassifies it. So the original example was taking an image of a panda, which the model predicted was over 95% confidence was a panda when it originally looked at it. And then with the special noise superimposed on top of it, it predicted it was a gibbon with 99% confidence. And this is the kind of noise that a human could not detect. So in other versions of presentations I've done, I basically look at the Terminator as an attack surface, with the premise being, how can I hack the Terminator to make sure that it can't go back in time and recognize Sarah Connor? So here we have an image of Sarah Connor, aka Linda Hamilton, who plays Sarah Connor in the movies. And then we create these special perturbations, the special noise, and then this open source model that I used, it's called Clarify AI. It's since been taken down. But basically I could show it this picture and it would predict that is Harry Styles with 99% confidence. And I've deliberately dialed up the noise so that you can see it. Ideally you can't actually see that noise and it would still work about as well. But when I say that there are untargeted perturbations, that means that I basically want the model to predict anything. There's no specific target in mind. I don't care if it predicts that's Harry Styles or Hermione Granger or anyone. But I could do an equivalent that is targeted, so I could specify who I want that target to be, and then the noise ends up looking a little bit different based on the statistical patterns that the model understands when it makes a decision, and then I can create noise that will make it predict it's Hermione Granger or Emma Watson. That relies on access to the model, but because most models tend to generalize, they all kind of work the same internally. I can create that noise based on one model, give it to another model, and it's almost as effective. So in adversarial machine learning, that attack wasn't considered that realistic. In reality, it's very hard to inject specific noise into a computer vision model, the kinds of models that look at, do vision things. But there are over 100 different kinds of adversarial machine learning attacks, and many of them are much more realistic. So if the original premise was injecting special data into a model so that it doesn't work as intended, that's basically defining prompt injection. So instead of, we're using special, malicious words, or they're written in specific ways to disrupt the model and make it, bypass its guardrails and give you something like that. So if we think about the model as like an attack surface, as we would any other software system, there are different kinds of models. So the top example is a very basic computer vision model based on a convolutional neural network. And then the bottom is a transformer, which is the backbone of natural processing capabilities like large language models. So all of these different attacks can work slightly differently at different stages of the different kinds of models. And again, I'm using the Terminator as an example, but to what extent they're realistic, again, depends. But something that's really key is that this is looking at the scope of the machine learning model rather than the AI system. And when we're looking at these more statistical-based attacks, it's a really important distinction, because the kinds of defenses that might work at the model level are different to the kinds of defenses you would think about at the system level, which is a bit more like traditional cyber and InfoSec flavoured. So that's the backstory. So I was doing all this work, feeling kind of depressed. I had this really hacky YouTube channel, and then I did a DEF CON talk, and it started to get a bit more attention. I still felt kind of crap about myself. The DEF CON talk was very, very stressful. I don't think I want to do it again. I had so many misogynistic comments on the YouTube video, but I'm glad I did it, because that's how No Starch Press found me, and they reached out to me and asked if I had ever considered writing a book. And yes, I mean, I would have loved to, before then I would have loved to write a book. And I was thinking about how on earth I would actually do that, how to make it happen. But I've since learned that, the editors at No Starch Press and other publishers are usually looking at people who do a lot of public speaking, or they're active on YouTube. So if there's one big recommendation I have, if you're interested in it or you're becoming interested in it, it's that you could know all the stuff, but without a public presence, no one is going to know that you know that. So, depending on your specific niche, there are different editors who are looking in different places. For example, I'm not really a software engineer, I'm a data scientist, so I don't live on GitHub, I don't have tons of repositories, I don't do a lot of, code that stays where it is, models just kind of evolve, you give it to someone else. So, for example, I wouldn't be active on those kinds of sites or bug bounty platforms or whatever. But if that's the niche that you're in, you just got to find where people are going and where people are looking. So in the journey of the book, those were very, very helpful. And I definitely recommend that kind of presence. Let's skip the slide. Okay, so now we go back to September of 2024, and that's when they reached out to me. And the process itself was very, author-led. I had to define things like deadlines and when I would be able to get the book to them, but it was very much based on how long I thought it might take. So I basically had the liberty to, predict how long it might take me to write a book, which is really hard. And like I said, I'm totally misjudged. But yeah, I essentially gave myself a year, maybe 9 months from the start date of December that year, based on just sort of knowing already how long I took to write, because I'd done a PhD, so I could sort of calculate really haphazardly and obviously incorrectly. But for example, I know other authors who are working in teams, which I hadn't really considered at the time, but I know a few other No Starch Press authors who work collaboratively, and they'll split up chapters between them and then either work on it in parallel, or they'll sort of hand it over to each other at the appropriate stage, which I think is a really good way of doing it if you have a lot of commitments, or if you want to write a book that's quite broad and you feel like the input of other subject matter experts would be really useful. I also know lots of other solo authors who kind of gave themselves a bit more breathing room, they gave themselves up to 2 years to write it. At the end of the day, writing it in 9 months was possible, but it was really awful. In a good, I enjoyed writing it, but I remember, I went on a writing retreat in New Zealand. I'm from Australia, so it wasn't, that far for me. But I went to Queenstown and I booked a week in this kind of cute inn motel style thing, and I was like, this is going to be great. I'll just write during the day, and then I'll go for little walks, and I'll go to cafes. And I had deadlines that I was tracking to, so I kind of knew how much I need to get done in that period of time. And what it ended up looking like was I'd wake up at 7 every morning, I'd like have a quick breakfast and then immediately start writing, have a quick walk, but then it'd be like 10 p.m. suddenly and I had to like go to sleep. So it was pretty grueling, but I know other authors who do things like writing retreats, and I think a week isn't really long enough because you want to go somewhere and not feel pressured to tourist as well. You don't want to feel pressured that you're going to miss out on the beautiful sights of Queenstown because you're sitting in a room that's facing the opposite direction. So I know authors who've done retreats that are like a month long, and I'd probably recommend that. Even just to get in the right headspace and not having to context switch so much. I think that's probably something that I would do differently next time. But for the most part, it was, hard, but not impossible. It just meant a lot of writing on weekends, and I run my own company, so I was able to have some flexibility with that, but also meant that everything else kind of slipped. Something had to give, and I had to get the book done on time, so it was other things. But it was worth it because I also am a digital nomad, so being able to travel around and do it all was like, it's the kind of work that you can do very flexibly. So it was ultimately a nice experience, but I definitely would recommend thinking about that and giving yourself more time if you're trying to figure out how much time you'd need to take on a project like that. The editing process was really, really wonderful. Like the editor that I worked with at No Starch Press was so good. And I know authors who've worked with other publishers and they've found it challenging. But working with No Starch Press was incredible. Like, I worked with Frances. If anyone is looking into it, Frances was incredible. Because I would give her a piece of writing, and she was able to say, actually, that's technically incorrect, that thing that you said, and also it would be much better if you just did all of this. It felt like having a co-author almost. When I've spoken to people who are a bit nervous about writing a book, a lot of the time they might be a bit, not very confident about their writing style or how clear it might be, or being able to convey technical ideas to an audience. But working with an editor was really great, and she took on a lot of that burden. I don't think I'm a terrible writer, but I certainly, the book comes across much better than my actual writing skills. The other thing I'll say is that keeping the audience in mind is really important. So a publisher like No Starch Press deliberately tries to write for an audience that knows a bit about something, but probably isn't already an expert, or at least the emphasis is that you write in plain English. They're meant to be digestible technical books, not the kind of technical book that you dread reading. Whereas I know other publishers, that's not always the case. If you're working for an academic publisher, you're probably going to be writing more for an audience that is already that subject matter expert, and you're helping them refine their knowledge of something. But for No Starch Press, I really like that it was meant to be plain English. I think it's the kind of book that I would have wanted to read, 5 years ago when I was starting to get more into adversarial machine learning. But the editing process was pretty arduous. I think for the first chapter, which had more edits because I was still getting used to writing and still getting used to the style and refining what the book was going to be about, there ended up being 11 versions. And some of those were really big, substantive changes. And towards the end, they became more polishing and making sure that I wasn't accidentally copywriting other people's images, and that kind of thing. But 11 versions is still a big burden of editing and reviewing editing while you're also trying to write the other chapters. I've also heard of publishers where they get an entire manuscript and then edit at the end. So I recently met Ali Mellon, who wrote Code Wars, and she said that was essentially the process that her publisher, I think it was Wiley, that they took. And to me that sounds awful and so stressful because, I don't know, what if there was some big... I'm imagining if I wrote it, I would have like misjudged something really big about like what my author knew or what should be in there, and then only having a few months to go through that editing process at the end would be really hard. But at No Starch Press, they did it throughout, so I'd submit one chapter, they would edit it while I was writing the next chapter, and so on. And then it went into production. So once I submitted everything to them, something that I didn't really think about was, I guess, what happens after I wrote it. So the production process was really, really long. I finished writing the actual book in like September last year, and it has now officially come out. I think last week people started getting print copies, and then it's available in most booksellers who gets No Starch Press books from June. But once I submitted it in September, even though it was mostly edited, there were so many additional checks. So I mentioned, for example, making sure that none of the images were copyrighted. Because I did work with external graphic designers because I have no design skills. And so, like, there were a few times where we found out that accidentally used a figure or some kind of, drawing. There's all these, like, robot icons throughout or something that might have been copyrighted. So that process was really long. And then, typesetting and formatting the book, based on the specific, like, templates that they had so that they could give it to the printer, was a really, really long process as well. And it was not super arduous for me, but yeah, every few weeks I'd get a different version of the manuscript with a few things to check, and like little wording tweaks were still happening. But even while all those things were happening in the production process, there was still like an early release version that came out at the end of last year. So, for example, people who signed up and got that version have a version which is now different. Like, for example, the changes to the copyrighted images are still in there, so please no one sue me. Or some of the tweaks to wording is not in that original pre-release version. So something to keep in mind if you're looking at that process. Make sure there's nothing like too bad in that version, but they wouldn't let that get through. But I just found that whole process interesting because I also expected that there would be like one launch date, but it's more of a slower, I want to say, dribble. And so they have a really good marketing team, but a lot of the marketing is also author-led. So it means that I have to like think about like what on earth is, like, I'm not a marketing person. I really had to talk to friends of mine who are in marketing to figure out like what I can do in that process. And so having like a few staggered points was like quite interesting, but it's also, I don't know, marketing is hard to me because I don't know, there's a lot of I'm not a design-minded person. I just find all that quite hard. But it's also a fun challenge to get around because if you know your audience really well, then you kind of know what they like and you know where they are. So it's fun to kind of be a bit creative. So most of the production process wasn't that stressful for me, but I could tell it was very stressful for them. Because every so often I'd be CC'd in emails where they were like, "We're delayed. We must get this like tomorrow from you because otherwise it's not going to make it to the printer." And I was like, "Sure, okay." Like, I had no idea like what the printer timelines are like or how that works or the lead times. And I think it's like the whole process that I'm not really exposed to with how they then work with other booksellers to distribute the book is really interesting. For example, they distribute it through their own website, but also through Amazon, which traditionally is not like very favourable to authors and especially independent publishers. And then other bigger booksellers like Walmart, Barnes and Noble, but a lot of stores wouldn't necessarily stock those books. And so hearing the behind the scenes about like why that is and like the process of them having to go and pitch to those bookstores is quite interesting. And it's a whole process, but largely I don't need to worry about it too much. So I've mentioned that the physical book has already come out. I would have liked to maybe show it to you, but I actually haven't received my copy yet because I keep travelling. I know, no disrespect to No Starch Press at all, because the problem is me and that I travel around so much, but I found out that people started receiving their copies because they tagged me on Instagram and I was like, what? What do you mean you have a copy? And I think they're express shipping a couple to my Australian address because I visit Australia next week. So I will be able to pick some up there and I'll get to see it. But even going through like the cover art process, I can't remember which if the next slide has the cover artwork, and this click is a little slow. But if you can remember earlier, it's like the blue cover with like the robot on it. I wonder if maybe it's the next one. No, it's later on. But basically they asked me if I had any suggestions for the cover. They recently went through a rebrand, and they used to have all yellow covers with different sort of Futurama-style Bender-looking robots on them doing funky things. And Bill was talking about how he wanted to like change all of the books and like kind of pivot that design direction. And they asked me what I wanted the cover to be, which is really hard because, again, I've said I have no design skills. But one theme that kept coming up through the book was the analogy I use of like an assistant-style robot called Chris AI, which is based on, like, I think one of the original robot stories from, like, Greek mythology or something. And so I gave the idea of having, like, some sort of mythical-looking gold robot. And that is basically what they went with. And they showed me a few options, and I was like, oh, they all look fine to me. Like, I have no idea. So I picked one, and I'm pretty happy with it. But I want to give everyone else the opportunity to win a free book, even though I still haven't got one. But let's see how this goes, because this is the first time I'm running this, and as I said, I'm not a marketing person. But I really want to give everyone the opportunity to win a copy. So if you go into Instagram and you look up Harriet Hacks, you can first of all see my really dodgy social media presence. But there's a post, and if you basically comment what you would write a book about, then in June I'll be picking someone to win a copy. So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to like jot down the handle, and then you can head over there, but you can do it later. One of the other things I found really interesting about the marketing process was, like, a lot of booksellers and a lot of publishers like No Starch Press are at this inflection point where they're moving from, like, traditional marketing to, like, leaning into social media. And it's really interesting to, like, watch that pivot and see how they do it. But while you're going there, or if you don't want to, that's also fine. Let me give you some tips that I found that I hope you can use in your writing process or whatever project you're looking at doing. Time management is, I guess, an important one. That's obvious. We know that time management is important, but how to actually make it work in practice, I think, is something that really depends on every individual and understanding what works for you. But what worked for me was if I had like strictly blocked longer periods of time. I know other authors who, for example, work a day job and then in the evenings they work on their book. That just doesn't work for me because I find it very hard to context switch. And because I was also writing my PhD at the time, doing a lot of writing meant that it was very hard to just like constantly switch between projects and writing a book. So I found it helped if I spent like a week doing like business and PhD stuff, and then a full week working on the book and blocking it off that way. Not everyone would be able to have that flexibility, but if you're like me and find that context switching hard, like having a dedicated long weekend to work on it can be really helpful, or booking like a longer writing retreat. I think those are the kinds of like time management techniques that have helped a bit more. Having deadlines also really helps with time management, like fear of not meeting the deadlines. But I will also say that No Starch Press was very, like, flexible with deadlines. They said that they would much rather have a good chapter than, you know, you submit something that's not great, just so that it makes the deadline. Persistence, also really important. Not just through the writing stage, I guess, but in terms of, you know, becoming a subject matter expert in that specific niche. And also, like, so the persistence and, like, getting to having confidence in your skills at that point. And then in the writing process, being able to, like, even when it felt like a grind, to just stick with it. The scope is really important to consider. Not everyone is going to love your book, but it's more about making sure that the book is the right fit for your audience. So the people that I had in mind was people who know a little bit about AI or a little bit about cyber, but were kind of at maybe a 10 out of 100. And it wouldn't leave them experts in it, but it would take them from 10 to 60, so that they then had enough information to pursue something more niche. And so thinking about what your audience really understands and wants to learn is really helpful. Sounds very obvious, but in the original chapter 1, I had a bunch of history about how bits work and computing. My editor was like, Harriet, that's ridiculous. Your audience wants to get straight into the AI stuff. They don't want to hear about the history of John McCarthy. So, there's a little bit in there, but understanding what that scope looks like is important. And then also having confidence to be able to, write for a technical audience. And technical audiences, as we know, can be very picky and can complain loudly. I said that in a nice way. It's a good thing if you're vocal about what you want, but you can feel a lot of imposter syndrome, a lot of fear communicating to technical audiences. But through all the interviews that I had as part of writing the book, I spoke to a lot of different kinds of technical folk all over the AI and cyber spectrum, and everyone was very supportive. And doing that interview process as well is also a really good way to get validation about what you're going to be writing about, not just in terms of the content, but making sure that it's the right fit for them. So building that confidence to know that you actually really know your audience very well. I have a newsletter if you're interested in seeing some behind-the-scenes stuff. Every so often I talk about what it was like, talk about other AI security stuff too. But yeah, so that's the cover, which I think is pretty cool. Cool robot. It was also created by a human, and not an AI, which I think is, being a responsible publisher / author in this time is really important. So my final question for you, the people who said they were interested in writing a book, do you still want to write a book? And is anyone else now interested in writing a book? No? Okay, well, in that case, if you don't really want to write a book, that's okay. You can read a book, and if the clicker moves ahead, I have a discount code for you. So you can get 40% off the book until the 14th of May using Prague 26. You don't want to, I'm not asking, I feel so uncomfortable saying that. It's there in case you want it. I'm very grateful that you're part of this audience, but, I'm also really keen to stay in touch. So if you have any other questions, or if you're looking at Starch Press as a potential publisher, or even others, I know a lot of people who've gone with other publishers and how that process is kind of different, going through agents and all that kind of thing. Definitely here to help you learn from my mistakes. So thank you so much for your time. Do we, questions? People can also leave.
Just one question.
Okay.
Front, so.
Yeah.
How did you make sure that what you write stays on top of things, in the sense that it's not outdated by the time when the book is out?
Yeah, I was really conscious of that in a space like AI, and given the long production timelines. The thing about adversarial machine learning, the niche that I started from, even though the book eventually looks at things like cyber system controls and red teaming and governance frameworks and that kind of thing, was, I guess, taking it back to basics and the core principles that haven't changed so much. So, I do obviously have to look at technology and what is current, and I use different case studies and stuff, but, some of the core reasons that the attacks work is because machine learning models are brittle, they're not very robust. That's the kind of stuff that hasn't changed very much. Basic cyber principles like zero trust and monitoring, it's all about adapting them in AI-specific contexts. So I was really conscious that, as agentic AI was becoming much more of a newer emerging discussion point, most of the most of the best practice hasn't necessarily changed a whole lot. It's just how to implement it is different. But I also had different technical reviewers read each of the chapter, so I had a different perspective on whether there was something more like cutting edge I should be including. But yeah, it's a really good question because I was, quite really cautious of that. Thank you. Cool. All right, you're all free to go. Thank you.